Welcome to the Surgibots Podcast, powered by Cruxx.
That technology is really going to be the driving force of what other things are going to happen in the future. You don't necessarily need all the bells and whistles, right, to drive adoption. Not even coming down to the cost of the robot in some of the situations. What are the features and benefits that truly surgeons care about? There is a lot of that behavioral profiling and surgeon segmentation and physician behavioral mapping that we're doing to understand like what and why. I see that the footprint tends to be one of the biggest challenges. That each of the strategic players, first and foremost, have a slightly different approach that they're going after within overall orthopedics. That's what I think is going to be the business model of the future. It's going to be revolving around that data and how to use that data moving forward.
Before we deep dive into this episode, I wanted to take 30 seconds to introduce you to the sponsors of this season of the podcast, TTP. TTP is a technical consultancy that has a 35-year track record helping companies transform innovative ideas into market-ready products. Their 300-strong team of scientists, engineers, and designers all under one move can take care of your surgical robotics or imaging technology from a napkin sketch all the way through to early-stage commercialization. I was lucky enough to get the invite out to their Cambridge facility. They gave me eyes on a number of the projects they're working on, and not only is the facility state of the art, but the main competitive advantage I see with these guys is their people. A group of incredibly smart, focused, and friendly guys who do not shy away from a lofty engineering challenge. If you want to learn more about some of the work they've done or to talk more about a project you have in mind, shoot me a message on LinkedIn or visit their website, ttp.com, to get in touch with one of the team. So, hello Sabeen and welcome to the Surgibots Podcast.
Hi Henry, it's nice to be here, thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on, and I know from when we had our first call together that you're going to have some really interesting stories and insights for surgical robotics to tell. So can you just give us, first of all, a background of who you are and how you got here?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me on the show. I do appreciate that. It's exciting to be here and talk about the robotics opportunity. My background, I started in healthcare 20 years ago. And so I come from industry as a background. I started off my career with Stryker navigation, so had quite a bit of exposure to the initial image-guided surgery system, doing neuro, spine, hip and knee cases a long time ago, and had continued to grow through my trajectory within the industry over to Medtronic and then transferred over to Australia and New Zealand as a commercial and operational leader. Since then, I've transitioned over to the consulting side and I've had a chance to work with a number of different types of robots, both soft tissue and hard tissue robots, and on a lot of strategic guidance for the multinationals as well as with growth stage startups.
Okay. So tell us a little bit more about what is encompassed within your consultancy work.
Absolutely. So we do management consulting focused in the life sciences space across all of life sciences, pharma, biotech, and medtech. I co-lead the medtech practice with my colleague Evelyn T, and we work mainly with strategic growth stage startups and with investment funds. The work that we do is upstream and downstream commercial strategy. So, for example, making sure the companies or the portfolios are getting into the right market opportunity, as well as then the downstream opportunity of the utilization and the go-to-market strategies and beyond.
Okay, brilliant. And so let's go back to when you first came across surgical robotics then. Do you remember the first time you saw or started to hear about robotics?
My career started in robotics actually almost 20 years ago. So for me, I've been at the forefront for a really long time. I was young and green at the time, and I was with Stryker. Stryker was my first med device gig that I had, and we had just bought the Leibinger system from the German startup. And so I was on the initial team to bring that into the US market and working with neuro tumor section cases, spinal cases, as well as the orthopedic cases. So that was my first introduction to robotics. And so for me, I've seen the transition that's happened from almost 20 years ago to where things are at now.
Okay, so let's talk about the Leibinger system then. So what actually did the Leibinger system do, and what kind of cases was it enabling?
Yeah, and so I should refer to it as a Stryker system now because it is Stryker's system. We were working with initially a lot of neurosurgical cases, so brain tumor resection cases, and identifying new procedures for tumor resections, spinal fusion cases. So we were doing quite a few of that and guiding those cases. And then with the orthopedic cases, a lot focused in the knees. So that was the first market in hip and knee space that we really entered into, and doing unilateral and bilateral knees, and guiding. So it was a lot of image guidance and the robotics related to the knees.
Okay. So when you were bringing that to market, so how was it bringing a new to market surgical robot back then, 20 years ago? What were some of the challenges, and have you got any stories from those days?
Yeah. Nobody was using it, right? And so it's a capital purchase with a software opportunity on top of it. That was initially a one-time purchase. It's new. Why does a surgeon or a hospital system have to buy a $500,000 to $2 million robot, right? Depending on like which footprint that you purchased. Because at that time there were a couple different footprints that you could purchase as well. And so the challenge was really starting to create that market opportunity and identifying the need in the market and pushing the why. For why does someone want to use a robotic system, and what type of outcomes will it offer to them when we didn't have, and nobody had, it was so early on, what the impact of those outcomes could potentially be. It was a further challenge because it was a significant disruption to the workflow of the surgeons, right? They're not used to it, the staff's not used to it. And now if they're already hitting out a dozen knees in a day, if they're going between a couple of different rooms, for example, now they're being asked to use a robot that, or a system that is going to slow them down. So that was also a challenge. It was the uptake at the hospital level to purchase it. It was a workflow and the impact on the workflow. And then also, was this actually useful for the physicians, and why, and proving that out.
Okay. So you've obviously got a lot of challenges bringing that new disruptive tech to market, which I think still a lot of those reservations are still kind of echoed in the current market. So I guess from here, where 20 years ago, bringing a new disruptive system to market to today, like how have perceptions changed of robotics, and like how have you, I guess, like what's your experience been in terms of bringing new robots across that 20-year timeline?
A great question. So for me, what's been interesting is that there's a lot of innovation that's gone into robot and what the robots can do, right? So I think like we're looking at what can we do from a preoperative planning perspective and integrate that into the robot for intraoperative execution opportunity, and then what can the robot do intraoperatively as well, and what kind of impact does that have on outcomes? So the transition that I've seen is that, we've had a lot of technology integrations and advancements in the robots, and a number of different robots are coming out in the market with more niche opportunities and focused areas that they are looking to play in. But some of the challenges that still stand are related to adoption. We know that roughly 20% of surgeons are actually still using the robot when the number can be significantly higher. And we know that there's a number of surgeons that feel that this is still disruptive to their workflow, as well as not really buying into, whether this has improved their patient outcomes or improved their clinical outcomes in general. So there's still a lot of work to be done with the robot when it comes to adoption and understanding the behavioral profiles of the surgeons. But I think we've made headway. And I think that with the further integrations that are coming to market and the shift that's happening to the ASC setting, I think that's going to be where things get really interesting for not just the manufacturers, but also the surgeons.
Okay. So let's start off like getting a bit deeper with the utilization then, because I know this is like a lot of the work that you're doing at the moment is how to drive utilization, especially from big strategic organizations. So 20% is obviously quite low compared to what it could be. So we're here now. How do we get to the next stage, and what are you helping these companies to do to drive this utilization?
So there's a few different things that we're working on with different companies to help drive this utilization and understand where we can optimize the opportunity. The first is, what are the features and benefits that truly surgeons care about? So before implementing them into the future footprint, really recognizing like what's important to the surgeons and if it's even important, right? Like just because it's important to a strategic or we think, that it's important does not mean that it's important to the clinician. And so there is a lot of that behavioral profiling and surgeon segmentation and physician behavioral mapping that we're doing to understand like what and why. One of the other things that we're working on and we continue to work on is, what segments would this be most opportune in? So right now, if we only have 20% of the surgeons that are using it, why is it just 20%? How can we expand that population to other segments, or how can we expand the procedures that the current 20% are doing beyond what they're already doing? So we're looking at that market expansion opportunity as another place to really optimize the usage of the robot. And then also looking at, just asset utilization. Are the companies really maximizing the utilization of this to the last mile? And if not, what else can we do to identify new opportunities?
Okay. So I guess we've kind of touched on a couple of points, but what's the real why behind why surgeons don't use a robot? Like, what are the core reasons you see as because there's disruption to workflow, but then some people are really using it effectively. So what's the why behind these people who aren't using it? And just give me a bit more detail on that.
Absolutely. So I think there's multiple levels to this. The first level is, are they bought into, will this actually improve their clinical outcomes? They don't necessarily want to feel like something can do, the procedure better than them. They feel that they're already doing the procedure well. So bringing something in that can potentially improve outcomes would be great, but can you prove that? Or is the robot going to drastically improve their surgery and show that they're not the best surgeon out there, right? So I think there's a bit of this behavioral part of it that's a hesitation as well. I think when we talk about the workflow disruption, it's about time, right? So we're looking at the time that it takes to get the robot set up and then torn back down and then reset up for another surgery, that workflow disruption to them, they want to get in and out of their surgeries, right? If they have a specific method to how they're doing their hips and knees, for example, and they're in and out of the procedure room, any additional time that's added to that procedure is a disruption, right? And that additional time is time that they're away from other procedures or other work that they need to be doing, or even friends and family, right? So that workflow disruption actually ties into the time that they feel that they're losing from using the robot as well. So I think those are probably the key things. And then again, I touched on whether the features are important to them or whether they've been important to the strategics, right? So because the robot has all these bells and whistles, if it's not important to the surgeon, they're not going to use it. And that's just the reality.
Okay. So do you think some of these robotic systems that are out there have sometimes been over-engineered, and actually maybe more simplistic solutions technologically would drive down that cost and also increase the surgeon adoption? Or do you think that's maybe a long take?
It's an interesting idea. I think that you don't necessarily need all the bells and whistles, right, to drive adoption. I think that if you've got a simplified footprint that has the core bells and whistles that are important to the surgeon and it's a reduced cost, then absolutely, especially with robotics, the cost, the business model in robotics is quite varied, right? You've got a number of strategics that place the robot into the hospital systems or the ASC. So it's not even coming down to the cost of the robot in some of the situations, but it is about still trying to drive the usage and then ultimately drive the implants, right? But I think that if you've got something that's a smaller footprint, that is fewer bells and whistles with really core capabilities of what the surgeons care about, then yes, that should help drive the usage. But I don't think you can ignore the fact that technology is here and the personalization of healthcare is here. And that's going to continue to grow in this segment specifically. So not having some of those additional bells and whistles will be a hindrance to like what capabilities you can have in the future, like with that technology, right? Like I think with the data collection and the preoperative to intraoperative to post-operative, even management of a patient and understanding what's happening, from a recovery standpoint, I think we can't dismiss that bells and whistles are going to be important in the future.
Okay. Sure. And what bells and whistles do you think are going to be important in the future?
What's that?
So what bells and whistles do you think are going to be important? What technologies do you think are going to be the real important ones moving forward?
So I personally love workflow optimization. And I talk about workflow optimization a lot, but it has a lot of different components to it. So I think I really think technology that assists in predictive analysis and outcomes that also touches on workflow optimization is going to be really key. So for example, with the robots, there's a lot of preoperative planners out there, right? And have a preoperative planner that can improve the workflow for the clinician and into the strategic opportunity that then integrates into the intraoperative opportunity. It's already done the segmentation of the tissue and the anatomy. It's already given the surgeon exactly the angles and the cuts that they need to make, right? And even down to what type of implant, like the size of the implant that they should be using. So all of that I consider as workflow optimization. And some of these opportunities, they're even able to predict what the surgeon's next steps should be, right? Based on best practices. So things like that, while they're in surgery, are really going to be driving, I think, the utilization of this robot or these technologies in the future. And then when we're talking about the post-operative opportunity, like anything that's tying back the outcomes of the patient back into what was identified preoperatively and done intraoperatively will also be part of that continuum.
Okay. So what about that post then? So you've told me, so what's that linking back? So what's that going to be, the last piece of the puzzle? So is that the patient afterwards linking it back to, I guess, using data? Tell me what that piece is.
Yeah, I think this is going to be one of the most interesting pieces that we're going to start seeing. It's going to be more around patient engagement and patient outcomes tracking. So apps that are engaging the patient post-operatively, the strategics that are engaging those patients post-operatively, the clinicians that are tied to that, the patients, monitoring the patient's outcomes. Like you've got Zimmer, for example, that has the implantable knee canary with the sensor and the Mind Mobility app. I think it's just come out here in the US, but it's been out overseas for a bit of time. So things like that are monitoring the range of motion and the gait on the patient post-operatively, and then tying that back into what the preoperative prediction was, and then the intraoperative cuts. So I think that's how the entire continuum is going to get connected, and the data from the post-operative side of things is going to come back into play.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. And I'm going to jump back to somewhere that we were going to go earlier, which is all about the changing senses of care and going into the ASCs. So can you just give a bit of an overview of what an ASC exactly is for people who are outside of the US?
Absolutely. So, of course, we know that one of the main care settings is a hospital setting, right? Inpatient hospital setting. And that's where procedures had generally started. The ASC, the Ambulatory Surgery Center, or also called the Day Surgery Center overseas, would just be things that can be done pretty in the day, right? A day procedure, the patient comes in and they're out back home. And so this shift to the ASC setting or the day surgery setting has been in play for a number of years with a number of different types of procedures and is going to continue to grow. So with the ASC setting, we know that orthopedic surgeries are, a significant part of the procedural makeup here in the day surgery center. And that's going to continue to grow. So the orthopedic segment in the ASC setting is going to grow even further over the next several years. We're expecting that the spine procedures in the ASC setting will grow and transition out of the hospital setting, a few more out of the hospital setting. And then cardiovascular, actually, so soft tissue side, we expect there to be a significant growth in the cardiovascular procedures into the ASC settings as well.
So what's actually driving this growth in the ASC settings? Is it because surgery is getting better and so people can go home same day, or what's driving this shift away from the hospital into the ASCs? And why do we necessarily need a different center from a hospital and an ASC? Why are they not integrated together?
It's a great question. So the ASC segment here in the US is quite fragmented, right? In some situations, the hospitals own some of the ASC settings. In other situations, private equity owns it. Other situations, physician groups own it. Or in other situations, like a private group of physicians might own just the one setting, right? So it's really fragmented system here in the US, and therefore each of the drivers for the ASC setting here is different, right? So each ASC, it's a different business model or driver that is important to the groups that are involved there. Now, what's driving this is that, I think being able to reduce the time that a surgery takes and shifting the ones that can be done in the day setting, that's driving it. The workflow. So ASC surgery centers tend to be really efficient with their turnaround. And, that's been a draw for a lot of surgeons, to be able to do a number of more procedures same day than they can do in the hospital setting. And also, we've talked about, with this fragmented ownership with the ASC settings, if the surgeons have ownership, which there's a lot of surgeons here that own some fraction of an ASC group or setting, that's of interest, financial interest to them as well. So I think that's a big driver, and we're going to continue to see that ownership shift a bit more. Right now, the ASC settings tend to be owned from the physician side of things with older surgeons. Right. So they're the ones that are driving which procedures and that they want to do in there, which robots they want to bring in there. The younger surgeons that are more technologically savvy are not the ones that are currently have ownership stake in the ASC settings. But in the next 5 years, 10 years, that's going to change significantly. So the more technologically savvy surgeons are going to have more ownership into the ASC setting. And I think that's going to drive even more procedures into the ASC setting as well.
Cool. So we do already have some robots in the ASCs, but there's also lots of challenges getting robots into ASCs currently as well. So what are some of those challenges, and why what robotics companies doing to actually access the ASC at the moment?
So I think with the strategics and with the ASCs in general, there's a couple different challenges that come into play. So first and foremost, I see that the footprint tends to be one of the biggest challenges, right? Each ASC set up differently, is configured differently. The internal structural workflow is set up differently. So the footprint is going to be really important. And some of these larger footprints work for all the ASCs. So that's one structural barrier to getting the robots or more robots into the ASC setting. And I think that's being addressed by smaller footprints that are coming out by either innovation and these amazing startup companies that are coming up from different parts of the world, or you've got some strategics that are also looking at smaller footprints to get into the ASC setting. So that's one consideration. The other consideration is that a lot of the robotic platforms, all of them, almost all of them, like from the strategic side of things, like when we're talking about hard tissue specifically, they're closed platforms. So they're very specifically designed to work within the ecosystem of that strategic partner. And therefore, what that means is the technology that strategic partner is using for preoperative or intraoperative planning and everything is tied to that robot, including the implants that robot is driving. So that tends to be a bit of a barrier for some of these ASC settings or even rural settings, because if they're looking to buy a robot and they're only going to buy one robot, do they necessarily want to commit to one orthopedic implant, right? And only that for all of their surgeons. And not all of them want to do that, right? So this is where innovation is coming into play, trying to look for open platforms and finding opportunities where you can have smaller footprint with an open platform that would be more amenable for the ASC setting. But I think that's going to have its own challenges itself.
I'm interrupting today's episode to bring you a word about one of our sponsors, Fundamental VR. If you go back to season 1, you'll find a great episode with Richard Vincent, the CEO of Fundamental, on all the reasons why training in the virtual world can shorten the learning curve and reduce training burden and costs. Improve competency at scale with interactive digital twins of your surgical robot or medical device in a high-fidelity virtual environment. Drive commercial success with Fundamental VR's virtual reality solutions. Yeah, so this is one of the topics I was going to talk about actually. So these implant agnostic platforms that are enabling some of these, they're even partnering with a lot of the joint replacement companies who have total knee solutions or total hip solutions. Like, do you think they pose much of a threat to the strategics that are driving with their business model? It's to drive the sale of the implants. So what do you think about this battle between agnostic and a restrictive platform?
Yeah, it's a hot debate at the moment, right? So I think that from the strategic side of things, they're looking at it, and I think the thoughts are that the open platforms aren't going to make it. That the closed platforms, are going to be the ones that end up dominating because they will have the business share. But when we look at the numbers again, it's 20% of the robotics, or 20% of the surgeons that could be using robotics are actually using robotics. Right. So I do think that the open platforms have some type of opportunity to play in the orthopedic space. But the challenge or opportunity, I guess you could say, for these companies that are driving the open platforms would be to find the business models that really align with the ASC settings. Right. So right now you've got the orthopedic companies that are putting in these robots like on a leasing model, or just putting the robots in for free to drive implant usage. And if the surgery center does X amount of implants, they're not paying for the robot. And so if you've got an agnostic platform, someone has to pay for it, right? You're not getting any money from the implants, right? So I think the business model is the place that we're going to see some creativity need to come into play.
Okay, interesting, because obviously, yeah, like with these mid-sized players who don't have a robot, who produce the total knees, who don't necessarily have a robotic system, have the opportunity to partner, they're not going to go anywhere, and they're going to sort out solutions. But it's not feasible for every single company to spend $100 million actually developing a robot in-house a lot of the time. So partnership is going to have to happen. But what I do wonder is, like, what with these business models? So I know that business model innovation is something that you're thinking about a lot. So what kind of business models, I guess, exist, if you can break those down? And then what do you think is going to be the kind of business model of the future that's going to start coming into play and start to dominate?
So this is a big question, right? This is a really big question, and I think we could have an entire different conversation on this. Like when I look at the business models that are currently in play, and I'll talk about it from a very high level perspective, because I think getting further detailed into it is going to go down rabbit holes for each of the different types of opportunities. So if we're talking about the business models from a high level perspective, you've got a capital sale, right? You've got a capital product, which is a robot. A lot of technology integration that's going into the robot is actually being eaten up or paid for by the strategics. So they're not making money on that. They're really trying to find the opportunity to drive the implant sales. At the core, these companies are implant companies, right? With the bells and whistles of the robot. So the business models are currently tailored towards what can be done to drive the implant sales, and how can they optimize that. Now, I think that's currently where things sit, right? And they're not charging for some of the technology integrations, but they are hurting. They really need to find new ways to work with these business models and partner with the ASCs or the hospital settings to find ways that are going to be a win-win situation or solution for both parties. Now, I think the business models of the future are going to look at the data that's being captured either preoperatively or intraoperatively in surgery, the data that's being captured postoperatively with any type of engagement that's happening with the clinician. So even like a clinician engagement app, like looking at the surgical procedure afterwards. And this is still tied to robot, or the patient engagement app. And then how can they optimize that from like an improvement perspective, so clinical improvement or efficacy perspective, prediction of outcomes perspective, so either the prediction or the value-based outcomes, as well as what has been streamlined from a workflow planning perspective, and then like what's happening at a population health perspective. So like all that data that's coming into play, how can the strategics, and I say this like candidly, like how can the strategics use this data and identify trends that are happening down to that center level, a center-based level, right, and make it more relevant to partner back in a different way with the ASC settings or the hospital settings. And that's what I think is going to be the business model of the future. It's going to be revolving around that data and how to use that data moving forward.
Okay, that's super interesting. And I guess that's like data, who owns the data in the future is who's going to win is a quote I've heard from another guest who's coming on this podcast. So it's definitely where everything's going. But how at the moment do the big strategics stomach the cost of a surgical robot when like they have a certain margin on their implants and then they have to also provide a surgical robot? So how are they stomaching that cost at the minute? And is that driving, I guess, obviously if they're increasing the price of the implants, then the implant demand may go down because people will start to look elsewhere. But how are they managing to stomach this cost? And is this not going to cause quite a large problem for these in the future in terms of profitability?
Look, I think profitability is always a concern, right? Regardless of the company, I think profitability is always a concern. I think that orthopedics is a really interesting market. It's a fascinating market because of all the different types of products that are involved with orthopedics. And so with that being said, the COGS are different across the entire portfolio. The way the adoption's done is different. But ultimately, margins are actually quite high on implants. And, while there hasn't been a lot of innovation on implants, margins are high on implants. And so now with the innovation, it's really the robotics that are trying to drive the implants. And I think that like really the companies will be profitable if they can drive more implants. And that's what they're really trying to do. But beyond driving the implants, I think this is where we go back to the data. And, how do they work with the data and partner back with their customer base to optimize that? And then everyone can be profitable, right? I think we can do so many things with that. And we've done a number of different projects where we've looked at data and identified trends down to the center level or population health, the predictive opportunities of, what do those hospital systems or the ambulatory surgery centers need to be prepared for in the future for what type of acute event. There's a lot of ways to use that data.
Okay, that's really cool. So moving on to, I guess, what the strategics I'm looking at from an acquisition perspective. So we know where they're at the moment. We know where they're at with their platforms, but what are they looking for from the companies from an M&A perspective? Who are they looking to acquire? What are they looking to acquire, and what technologies are they looking to bring into the business?
So obviously I can't talk about details, right? For confidentiality reasons, but each of the companies have a very, interestingly enough, they have a different focus. Right. So they each have a different focus of what type of technology that they're looking to acquire or integrate. If it's a global play, like a global strategy play, or if it's a regional strategy play, for example, which technologies will integrate into their future strategic planning, the next 5 years and 10 years and 12 years planning. And a lot of that's also tied to other initiatives within the company as well, and the focus. So what I'm seeing is that each of the strategics in this space have a slightly different angle, which is going to make the future even more interesting, I think.
Okay. So I guess if you are a startup or mid-size who's looking to be acquired by one of the big strategics, like what can you be doing from a few different angles to make yourself an attractive spot and make yourself, I guess, buyable by a big strategic?
It's a great question, and I think that's the key question that everyone's always asking, right? That's on the innovation front. The first thing is making sure that you not only have product market fit, so there is a product market fit in the geographies that you're serving, and that you're aligned with the growth of the portfolio of the company, of the strategics. So if your product fits in the market but isn't aligned with strategic X and the vision for growth that they have, then it's going to be a hard negotiation, to get them across the line. It's probably not going to happen. So I think those are probably the two key things. It's that product market fit and making sure that your product and what you can offer is aligned with the vision that they have for their company.
Okay. So should you be building your company for like one specific acquirer, or like how do you make it attractive? Because there's lots of people looking at different things. So like if they've all got a different perspective or looking for different things, how can you, I guess, make yourself attractive for more than one so that you're getting a better offer on the table?
Oh, this is $1 million question. And I say, well, it's a multi-million-dollar question actually, right? Like because it ties to exit, it ties to fundraising. It's the number one question I think that comes from a lot of the investors as well, right? That are putting money into these companies, and they want to make sure that they're, of course, increasing the valuation of the investment. So my suggestion is that they engage early. So engage with all the different relevant corporates early. Understand early on the direction that they're going, but also really be clear about the value proposition and the capabilities of the company itself. Like your own company, the innovation, be confident in what the value proposition is and what you can deliver that's unique to what the corporates don't currently have. Because really that's what they're looking for, is that additive value into their portfolio when they're looking at acquisitions and growth. So if you can have something that's a unique value offering that others don't have, and you've engaged early to ensure that you're aligned with what the future market looks like, then I think you increase your chances of having multiple strategics interested in you.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting from a number of different perspectives. And what about in terms of like building the company for like technology integration? So is there anything that you can do from a technological perspective to make it easier to be acquired or anything like that?
Yeah, so I'm not I don't have a strong technical background, right? I'm a commercial and operational leader by background, but when it comes to strategic guidance and the work that I've done in the past in this particular area of making sure that the companies are set up correctly, it's usually related to making sure that the back-end APIs and like the systems can talk to each other. So whatever system the innovation has or the startup has is able to talk to the systems that are within the corporate setting, as well as the other systems that are in the entire ecosystem, right? So in the healthcare ecosystem. So what I mean by that is if you are, let's just hypothetically say that your technology is looking at scans that are going to be tied to, being used intraoperatively, then can your system integrate with the hospital systems like scanning, like PAC systems and image systems, for uploading and downloading and things like that. So really it's that being the ability to integrate.
Okay, awesome stuff. And can you give me a couple of predictions for what's going to happen over the next 10 years? Where do you think the market's heading and what do you think is going to happen?
Oh, I love this. I love this. I think it's going to be interesting. I think that each of the strategic players, first and foremost, have a slightly different approach that they're going after within overall orthopedics, right? So I'm going to just say it from that perspective. So I think the next 10 years will be interesting to see how each of the strategics is set up a little bit differently than where they are at now. I think with the technology, AI and ML is going to be everywhere. Like everyone is going to have to get really comfortable with the AI ML opportunity across all the different levels. So the strategic level, the hospital, ASC level, the clinician level as well, since we see a bit of hesitation at the clinician level for that, and then also optimizing the use of that with the patient side of things. So that technology is really going to be the driving force of what other things are going to happen in the future. And I think that we're going to have more interesting reimbursement structures put into place as well. And this is going to be tied to the technology, the AI ML technology that's predictive in nature, and then like identifying what's happening intraoperatively and then postoperatively. So all of that data that's being collected, and then the advancements that's happening with all of the systems. I think we're going to see that shift with the reimbursement, because now the insurance companies are going to come back and say, well, now we can predict what you did correctly or didn't do correctly, and you didn't follow the preoperative plan or the intraoperative guidance, and now the patient's outcomes are not what was predicted, right? So I think that's going to be an interesting play as well, the reimbursement side.
Okay, so let's dive a bit deeper in that, because that sounded like super interesting. So what does that really mean for the surgeon? So if the insurers are coming back and saying the surgeon, yeah, you didn't do this correctly, you didn't follow the guidance, and therefore you've not got an optimal outcome, what is that going to mean in terms of the insurance? Does it mean they pay out less to the patient and the surgeon bears that cost, or what does that really mean?
Yeah, I think this is where value-based healthcare is really going to start. It's already here, right? But I think that's where it's going to be another sticky point for value-based healthcare and the payments that are based off of that. I think that is going to be something that everybody in the ecosystem, the strategics, the hospitals, the ASC settings, the clinicians are going to have to be really closely involved with, since, I think it's realistic that the insurance companies are going to come back into play on that. However, that being said, I do think that there could be resistance, right? With the AI technology involved and with this type of analysis, there could be resistance from the hospitals that they don't want to have that type of information identified down to the clinician level or at the hospital level, right? That could impact their reimbursements. So I think that's going to be a challenge that will have to be addressed as well.
Okay, and how do we address those challenges if there's if as a medtech industry, if there's pushback from the hospital because they don't want to release, I guess, their dirty little secrets, and I guess from the insurers and payer sides, they do want to push it through, and there's medtech, we want to make more revenue as a capitalist economy. I guess what's going to happen is in this big melting pot of all these things.
I feel that ultimately, if with everything being driven by the data in the future, in general, I think that hospital systems will probably be forced at some point in time to adopt. Yeah, I think that's going to happen. So I think you'll have your early adopters as well, and there'll be the academic centers like the Stanfords of the world that are really ingrained with technology and confident as well with the results that they're putting out there. Then eventually you'll have your middle adopters, and then later you'll have to get the laggers, and they'll join because they don't have any other choice to join.
And something super interesting I've seen, Sabeen, is that you're now on the Forbes Business Council and also a contributor to Forbes now. So can you tell us a little bit more about how that came about and what that really means?
Yeah, absolutely. So ironically, like I've been thinking about this for a few years, and the conversations had been a bit warm for a few years. I just hadn't pulled the trigger on anything until I felt more settled in the US, because I just moved back to the US about a year and a half ago. And with this particular opportunity, I'll be doing a series of articles for Forbes on for the next 2 years. And it's related to thought leadership and the lens that I have on the medtech ecosystem or healthcare ecosystem in general. Because I've worked with international governments, I continue to advise international governments. I have a macro lens that comes into play there. I worked with strategics. I continue to work with strategics. I've got the lens of the strategics. I work with investment funds from around the world, both venture capital and private equity. So I have a lens that comes in from that mindset, as well as working with growth stage startups. So really understanding what's happening at the innovation in the innovation ecosystems at the granular level. So my areas of focus for the Forbes series will be bringing together all of those different experiences that I've had throughout my 20 years in healthcare and with all of these different stakeholders, and identifying where the gaps and opportunities are in the future.
So Sabeen, thank you very much. That was definitely a super, super interesting conversation, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who got a lot out of that. And so people probably want to reach out to you after this. So can you tell us where they can reach you and a little bit about what you can maybe do for them as well?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Sabeen Shaikh. I'm partner at LSC, leading the Global MedTech practice, and you'll definitely be able to find me there. Or you can reach out to me or any of my team members on the Life Sciences Consultants website as well, consultingls.com. The areas that we can support in are across all of life sciences. I co-lead the MedTech practice with Evelyn T. So we are working directly on upstream and downstream opportunities in areas that we have deep domain expertise in.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for being a guest. Absolutely loved it.